Good day, colleagues. I am Mukhtar Rabban from the Humanizing Pedagogy Praxis and Research Niche at Nelson Mandela University. And on behalf of the Humanizing Pedagogy Project and the Learning and Teaching CoLab, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all to our third webinar in the Exploring a Humanizing Pedagogy series. We are ecstatic and grateful today to welcome a well-known scholar, Dr. Rohit Mehta from the United States. We also welcome all the participants and Facebook viewers who have been joining us over the last few weeks. Today's webinar will feature a keynote address from Dr. Mehta, followed by a Q&A session. Before I formally introduce our speaker, just a few house rules for today's webinar. The mics have been muted for the duration of the presentation. Please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat while the presenter is speaking. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, and all questions will be posed at that stage. You may also raise your hand or request the mic in the chat, and I'll send you a request to unmute. And you're also welcome to send your questions directly to me by selecting my name from the drop-down. We are looking forward to an engaging session this afternoon in South Africa, and it might be morning. It's definitely morning in the States, and wherever it might be, wherever you are connecting from today. Colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rohit Mehta to Nelson Mandela University's Humanizing Pedagogy webinar series. Dr. Rohit Mehta is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction in the Kremen School of Education and Human Development at California State University, Fresno, the United States. He participates in transdisciplinary educational scholarship with an intention of designing humanizing and inclusive learning experiences for students and teachers. Dr. Mehta teaches educational psychology courses from critical and humanizing perspectives. He writes on the intersections of education and colonization, oppression, creativity, and technology. His collaborations with colleagues from across the world have been published in academic journals like Thinking, Skills and Creativity, Tech Trends, Journal of Technology and Teacher Education, Journal of Digital Learning in Teacher Education, and the Journal of Media Literacy Education. He's currently working with teachers in rural and urban settings to use technology in creative, inclusive, and engaging ways. Dr. Mehta, it is an absolute honor to host you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Rabban, for warm welcome, and thank you to Nelson Mandela University. It's an honor to be here and be talking to all of you. I'm gonna share my screen with you just to make sure you can see the slides. Right, you can, right? Okay, perfect. All right, so so many things I want to talk about and so many things to discuss. So when I got this invite, I've been digging into humanizing practice for a few years now, with an intention, like Dr. Ban pointed out in my introduction, with an intention of designing inclusive spaces for our teachers and students. That has led me on multiple different directions, especially thinking in terms of role of technology. And that has been unraveling for a few years now, which has led me to this presentation. So I'm titling it "Countering Neoliberalism in Education," and thinking of what I'm doing with classical curriculum design and instructional technology as more of an experiment, and not in the usual scientific way we think about it, but just more of a playing and tweaking with ideas. I'm putting the term post with humanizing because I think I'm also kind of thinking from more of a decentering an anthropomorphic viewpoint and how we think about our role in the world, thinking beyond just human beings and how we are affecting our environment and other animals as well, other life forms. What would that mean if we took into account all those things? So that's what I'm intending to talk to you all about. And I'm really happy that we have like a chunk of time, 30 to 40 minutes to just discuss and then followed by Q&A. So I'm really excited. I'll start with a quick introduction about myself. Like Dr. Irvan pointed out, I'm an assistant professor at Kremen School of Education and Human Development. I work in the Department of Curriculum and in Instruction. My job is to focus on K-12, but mainly secondary school settings with an intention of instructional design and instructional technologies role. To get to this path, it's been a convoluted journey. Felt like I was wandering and lost most of the time because I come from India, and when I was growing up, at least, it we fell into the pressures of cultural trends, and we did what our parents wanted to do, what our societies wanted to do. So I too was an engineer first, and then figured out what I really wanted to do with my life. I'd been interested in arts and humanities and world cinema from longer than I can remember. So finding myself in engineering was quite a cognitive dissonance for me. Um, I was a good student, so I still managed to stay afloat. But I'd been trying to find a way out ever since, and education has been that route for me. I taught, or I used to teach in engineering colleges in India, and that gave me a little bit of confidence to jump into educational doctoral work, which I did through my PhD in educational psychology and educational technology at Michigan State with Dr. Punya Mishra, if you're aware of his work on TPAC and creativity. And that's how I dabbled into more open-ended and more critical views of technology and creativity and play. And it has its fingers pretty much in anything that you want to talk about related to education. Um, Through in this unbounded journey, as I find myself working on these issues, one thing that I have a hard time um, ignoring, even though I don't want to ignore it anymore, is the history, the colonial history of my own upbringing. And as I say the word history, and think it's not really a history, it's our present. So I grew up in what was called a post-colonial India, to realize that coloniality is an ever-existent, because it doesn't really go away. You can see that in the popular discourses that easily embrace anti-blackness, Islamophobia, white supremacy as internalized. Um, it's a small example that you may have heard of is like skin whitening creams that were popular in India. I mean, I'm using the term were because it's starting to get a little bit of attention now, finally. I'm thinking of the work of Frantz Fanon, Black Skins, White Masks, and what it means to just fall under the master narrative of for people of color to kind of internalize the idea of white supremacy and live lives like that. So it becomes a struggle about liberation, and education, once again, puts you in a very unique spot to be able to address that, the influence of coloniality and its practices and beliefs in education. My work is informed by amazing scholars with me, before me. I'm thinking of Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, on her work on decolonizing methodologies. That's her perspective has helped me be more critical of how we define knowledge, uh, what knowledges do we consider to be worthy of inclusion in higher education, in academic spaces. Dr. Eve Tuck and her work on decolonization in and through education, especially reminding us that decolonization is not a metaphor. It has to do with land occupation, and that needs to be a point of consideration, even though we're talking about this in and through education. I'm also thinking of Dr. Lilia Bartolome and her work on humanizing pedagogy and thinking beyond the methods of teaching and the fetish that comes with it. If we are thinking of challenging normative and Eurocentric perspectives of what it means to be literate, what it means to be educated, we need to move beyond the standardized methods fetish that Bartolome has talked about, what, a couple of decades ago now. Dr. Maria del Carmen Salazar, who was one of the presenters in this conference, in this webinar series, and her work on humanizing pedagogy and putting the student perspective at the center of that experience. And that is important, right? How do we go beyond controlling and beyond monitoring and beyond surveying students and towards a humanizing approach? And what would that even mean like? And of course, these scholars have been writing about that for a while, and Nelson Mandela University has been doing a lot of work around that. We're going to try and unpack a little bit of what that looks like. I'm also inspired by the works of Dr. April Baker Bell on linguistic justice and Black languaging. It reminds us how even what we consider to be norm in speaking and language it has injustice embedded within it based on what we choose to include and what we choose to exclude as academic, as professional, whatever terms we want to use around that. Terms nonetheless to exclude and push out versus to include and to deem as worthy knowledge. Also thinking of Dr. Ibram X. Kennedy and his work on anti-racism. So it's easy to say I'm not racist, but harder to acknowledge that we are all a little bit into it. And how do we actively work as an anti-racist as opposed to being neutral? And also Dr. Django Paris in culturally sustaining pedagogy. It's not just about being critical, it's also about maintaining a sustainable pedagogical framing that supports and continues to support historically marginalized students irrespective of what communities you are in. Dr. Paulo Freire's work, again, that goes without saying, pedagogy of oppress, pedagogy of hope, and finally, two more critical perspectives through Henri Giroux on critical pedagogy and his critique on neoliberalism that kind of shapes an important component of my talk today. And finally, Dr. Noam Chomsky, who has been an inspiration to me in just being critical in general, critical of power, knowledge, and capital, per se. And that brings me to this idea of countering neoliberalism in education. Before I try and unpack neoliberalism a little bit, the reason or rationale for me to choose neoliberalism as a focus when talking about humanization is that I'm trying to argue here that this economic influence has been at the center of, at least recently in past 3 decades, at the center of the dehumanization of our students across the world. We're talking about the push for standardizations and normalizations of what I would call white ways of knowing and being. Again, I go back to Fanon's work on the master narrative and how the rest is expected to just follow the norms set by the dominant discourses. There is little room left, if at all, for creativity and play. There have been concerns amongst educational psychologists and creativity scholars on how creativity and play is on decline in school systems. Some have been pushing for more informal spaces, some have been pushing for inclusion of these practices, but nonetheless, a decline, a concerning decline. Dr. Peter Gray, who's an evolutionary psychologist, has even connected this absence of play with increasing mental health issues amongst adolescents. So there's a lot to be concerned about, and there is some role that neoliberalism plays in this. So how do we move away from this teaching to the standards, to the test, and not just some, I'm not talking about some occasional ill-structured activities, but intentional creativity, intentional inclusion of diversity and play. into the classroom settings, and through small design changes for that matter. So when we're talking about neoliberalism, I'll show some examples of what that looks like today. But we're talking about global neoliberalism. We're not just talking about the United States context, although the United States is a perfect example of neoliberalism today. But this goes back to Ronald Reagan's work, not his work as if he was trying to do something constructive here, but Margaret Thatcher's policies as well. So we're talking about global neoliberalism. We're talking about global political and social systems. These political systems that frame commerce around free market systems, and individual interest is created and manufactured in a social class structure where individual is inspired to think that it's possible for them to enter free market at any point and find some social mobility to climb up on an economic and social power. Harvey, and I quote, said that human well-being can best be advanced by maximization of entrepreneurial freedoms within this neoliberal framework, within an institutional framework characterized by private property rights. So what he's trying to show here is that the real interest in neoliberal discourses are of private companies, big corporations, and individual interest is displayed as something that has value and worth, but that's not what we are seeing in the general trends in past few decades. One tiny example of that is from Canada in higher education, where between 1988 and 2004, tuition fees saw an increase in 300%, but funding per student saw a decrease about 40%. Seems like a normal fact, a normal trend that we see everywhere. But it shows how there's this marketization of higher education that has been going on since the 80s, that has made that has turned what higher education institutions offer into a product that needs to be sold to students, and less emphasis on actual care and funding for the students themselves. These examples are not just limited to education. Recently, if you're following the news, in India right now, there's huge protests going on by farmers who are opposing pro-market agricultural policy changes in India. What's happening is a corporatization of agriculture, and poor farmers, individual interests are being trampled on according to the farmers. This is also this role that big corporations and giant companies play in controlling economies, in navigating individual interests and freedom. This is not new to us. This is not just a neoliberalism problem. It has, once again, its roots in our colonial pasts and presents. I don't need to tell you, we are talking about colonization. Colonization wasn't done by the King of England on a horse trying to conquer. It was East India Company that spread its business across the world and slowly gained domination. And a big aspect of that was free slave labor, right? And this idea of getting labor was to support the economic systems, right? To support that market. And that creation has gone on, and of course has transformed many times in past centuries. And today what we see is more of a neoliberal market. And why we call it neoliberal is that it touts itself as a free, open market for anybody to come in and contribute. Usually is overlaid with really open and progressive rhetoric, like creativity and innovation. But what it really does is accumulate wealth at top for big corporations. And here's an example from like a couple of days ago, where CNN and New York Times reported how Nike and Coca-Cola were lobbying against a bill that was passed to oppose, or in process of being passed, to oppose the human rights violations of labor in China. So it makes you wonder, why would, it's a bipartisan bill, but why would big corporations like Nike, Coca-Cola, and Apple, for that matter, are opposing it? Because like companies of our colonial past, these giant corporations also benefit from modern day slave labor. So not a lot has changed in how global economics is being influenced by corporate interest. And this has roots, influence in education as well. We see this all the time. Big corporations, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, all have interest in education. We can see that it could be just from the good of their heart, but it's hard to believe that for me, especially given that education, especially public education, is $1 billion market, billions of dollars, market waiting to be explored, to tapped, right? How do you enter that market? By creating a progressive rhetoric around creativity and innovation, right? Google for education, Microsoft in education, Apple teacher certification. You can go to Facebook for education website and go over carefully how they are creating the rhetoric around their role in empowering people, quote unquote. So the beauty of all of this is that the rhetoric that is used, the language that is used to talk about education sounds just exactly like how you and I would talk about educational issues. But what is actually done, where the funding is actually spent, is quite different from what we'd like to do. And we'll talk about that technology role even more in a minute. So to counter this global neoliberal influence, and counter is a very strong word, because I'm only speaking from my point of view as a minuscule educator who's trying to do something that just opposes these influences a little bit, with the knowledge that I don't have control over how the global economy shifts and takes turns, right? But that's why we are talking about this. That's why we're trying to see, okay, what else can be done? So how do I position to counter these influences is through humanizing pedagogy. But of course, starting with this cultural and political awareness of what is really going on in our schools, in our educational settings, with these devices and technologies that are being literally handed to educators for free. And I think I'm not sure if that's true for South Africa, or other parts of the world, but you usually get heavy discounts on technologies if you are an educator, and we think that that's also out of the good of their hearts. And I hope that's true to some degree. But what it allows technology companies to do is to get our data, right? Attention of the user is what makes money for at least for social media companies, digital technology companies. The more time you spend with these tools and technologies, the more money we make for them. The more data you create for these companies, the more money they make, right? And on top of that, whatever we are doing, not just the data that you willingly share, but every single click of mouse, where you save your files, what you do on your computer, everything is being digitized, being, of course, encrypted and stored, and algorithms are able to read and extract those data. And there's a lot going on that is still just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm reminded of Dr. Safia Noble's work on algorithms of oppression, where she talks about the right to be forgotten. Do we not have a right to not be included in this giant landscape where our data is being mined and our digital identities can be constructed without our consent, just from the bits and pieces of our data? There's enough information about us out there that we can be reconstructed in whole, if not today, then in a few years. That's not the only concern, though. The concern is also around what these tools and technologies do to how we participate in educational praxis. Um, Many years ago, I'd say in late 80s or early 90s, teachers were more resistant to technological involvement. What was framed as a reason was that teachers were just not comfortable using these fancy tools. But what has also been argued is that people were skeptical about what these tools and technologies would do to the students and to the data and stuff like that. What has also happened is that we have also seen a shift towards standardization and assessment-oriented teaching and educational experiences. And some would argue, and myself included, that there is a role of neoliberal markets and privatization in these standardizations. What happens is that neoliberal markets are more efficient if you buy into the concept of free market, and market being genuinely free for anybody at any social status to be able to jump in and participate in the free market system for their own capital benefit. What really happens most of the times, as we see, is that big corporations are in need for more and more labor, right? People who are in line with these ideas and concepts think that the free market would give them a social ladder to climb the social class status, would participate in this as labor. For that labor to fall in line with the needs of the market, it has to follow a certain type of standards. If you deviate too much from that standard, then it's harder to control, at least control for the purposes of profit. So diversity, creativity, it really doesn't help this intention. It gets in the way of maintaining and sustaining a neoliberal market, a free market that is helping the corporate profit as we speak today. What this also creates is more of extrinsic motivators for students in school systems to pursue knowledge. Students can imagine themselves working or studying for the purpose of finding a job, but not looking at the education as a lifelong process in itself, but just as a means to an end. Dr. Peter Gray, who I mentioned earlier, has also shared concerns around this setting of externally motivated drive in education and what that means for mental well-being, for play and creativity. Another thing that these influences, neoliberal and colonial influences, do for education is create a false sense of a knowledge preference and hierarchy, that what type of knowledge systems are better than the other. Science has given a lot to all of us, right? But positivist and scientific methods have also been used, especially during colonial times and still today to some degree, to marginalize and oppress and frame people of color, historically, globally, and disregard, erase, undermine their knowledge systems, right? Our knowledge systems. What it means to be, to know, to do in some of more indigenous and some of more people of color communities is not really considered worthy of being a part of the main school system, right? The main school system has to be the Western Eurocentric knowledge system that we see all over the place. There's a marginalization of Black, Indigenous people of color ways of knowing that's rampant in educational systems and commonly accepted. Of course, in more academic and research scholarship circles, you would see a growing pushback against these approaches. Finally, one of the concerns or value systems that I'm trying to counter through humanizing pedagogy is the myth of efficiency and productivity. And I'm still trying to figure out how I frame this delicately, but I'm just concerned about the culture that we have created with technology that expects all of us to be efficient, meaning doing more things in less period of time. Time is a key factor here. Um, for some reason, we have convinced ourselves that the more productive we are, the more things we can achieve, the more fulfilling life we'd have. And I don't think that needs to be true. There's an absence of aesthetic and humanistic values and creativity. And if you dig deeper into some of the aesthetic history of aesthetics and creativity and the scholarship around it, you would see a people making case for actually the opposite of the kind of culture that we have created, uh, actually making a case for slowing down, having a need for downtime where you don't process any new information, which is very hard given that we are carrying these tiny boxes, metal boxes in our hands, in our pockets, with libraries bigger than the Library of Alexandria at our fingertips, right? It's impossible not to be processing new information all the time, not to be inundated by massive information. You have to choose consciously to be away from it. It has become such an inherent part of our lives that people feel this sense of anxiety when they're not with their phones. Um, with behavioral design and conditioning of the apps that we use, the endless scroll, you can keep going on, but it never ends. Those things are intentionally designed that way for you to have your attention on the device and not elsewhere. But what it ends up doing, in addition to all the stuff that I just mentioned, is divide your attention from what it competes against is from your participation with other people, with your family for that matter, right? So attention is the beauty of attention is that everybody's competing for it. It could be your 2-year-old child. It could be a big corporation. It could be a family member, a friend. In this struggle for your attention, obviously big corporations are winning big time. Um, and so there are social and personal repercussions for this as well, not just educational. In this cultural and political awareness, and I think we all know this, is the first step is being culturally conscious, being politically conscious, right? So the three things that I keep in mind as a lens as I'm trying to be more aware of historic and political context is first, of course, neoliberalism, its colonial and imperial influences and the similarities in the two approaches. And finally, the third point is the epistemological supremacy, this idea of some knowledges being better and more superior than other knowledges. Um, if you want an example of that, I'm of course ashamed in thinking about this, but growing up in a post-colonial country, we were trained by the Western methods of knowing and being. And what that did to me personally was that I was dismissive of my own cultural practices of knowledge construction and knowledge creation, right? So my local ways of knowing, my cultural heritage of knowledge, and India has decades, centuries, millennia long history of knowledge creation and works around mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and I disregarded all those things. And I know people did that. I was not the only one doing that. Created a sense of epistemological supremacy in my head as well. And it's not just something that we internalize; it exists in our social structures and systems. So being mindful of that as we move towards then applying these big theoretical and political constructs into our own pedagogy and praxis. As I transition into that I am also mindful that there are no best practices. Um, I mean, I go to these conferences where we have these special sessions on best practices, and it just doesn't make sense in the context that we are working in. Things are so subjective and dynamic and change not just by who you're teaching, but also by the ensemble of your students. If you change 2 or 3 students in your classroom size, the complete dynamic changes, irrespective of whether you are in a face-to-face space or an online space. However, online spaces make it a little bit easier for the instructors to kind of isolate students who are not contributing to the rhetoric, giving a lot of power to the instructor. And we'll talk about that as well. So, but being mindful that there are no best practices. At best, they are just pretty good practices, right? And I'm looking at this from Young Zhao's perspective, who talks about in his book and article on what works may hurt. A lot of pedagogies and practices that we take for granted may actually not be good for us, may be actually hurting us. And he draws analogies from medical research and asks us to think about the side effects of the pedagogical approaches that we take uncritically for granted. So think about whatever works, whatever is the best practice, who is it really best for? Um, so with that lens, I jump into these experiments in humanizing praxis, right? So like I said, I've been tweaking and playing with these ideas on a philosophical level, but also on a design level, on a curriculum design and instructional technology level. Like, what do I actually have to enact to make this happen in my classroom? Of course, there's an exposure to critical perspectives, right? Inclusion of critical voices and discourses within the curriculum. But it's also how we design that experience that can be humanizing or dehumanizing, or somewhere between that spectrum for that matter. So to counter these neoliberal influences, and we have been recently, my colleagues and I have been working on this idea of resisting these neoliberal influences. Let me share some ideas of what that would look like. What does that mean? It's like these small things, which may be small, but to implement them may come with institutional pushback. So I'll talk about that as well. So the first one being no deadlines or late submission penalties. This is something that I started experimenting with a few semesters ago, and this has become a consistent thing in my courses. I teach educational psychology courses right now to students who want to become secondary school teachers or who are in the graduate programs, working on programs like counseling, curriculum instruction, um, family and marriage counseling. These kind of programs have to take my educational psychology course as a required course to graduate. So I have students of different types, teacher candidates and graduate students who take these educational psychology courses. Educational psychology in itself has been mainly a Eurocentric field, right? Dominant with white ways of knowing and white perspectives of what counts as psychology, what counts as knowledge. So my first positioning was obviously to include counter narratives to what is taken for granted when it comes to learning theories. For example, countering behaviorist approaches to disciplining students, to controlling students, having a sense of power over them. What would that mean in classrooms today if we started to actively challenge the behavioral assumptions of punishments and rewards and reinforcements that we do with our students? Um, Thinking about cognitivism, constructivism, what does that mean about social cognition and embodied thinking? So countering not just the existing learning theories, but also intentionally including people of color, scholars of color, Black, Indigenous scholarships into educational psychology discourses. And I get a lot of pushback from my colleagues in EdSci, but well, you got to do what you got to do. So that brings me to this first point of having no deadlines and submission penalties. As I started working on these courses, started designing them with more critical perspectives, and as we shifted, especially I started to do this before COVID-related shifts happened to fully online education. But with that shift, I knew for certain that I had to do this. And this came from this idea of pushing back against the idea of efficiency, that we have to do a certain amount of work in a certain given amount of time. So I told my students that we will not have any deadlines anymore. They can work on the course whenever they want. They can work on the material however they want. Um, they will not have any penalties for any late submissions. Well, what would be a late submission if there are no deadlines? But then I was concerned that if I just let go of that, that does not give people who need a little bit of structure or scaffolding, that does not give them anything to hold on to. So what I did instead is I offered recommended dates and offered grading windows. For example, if an assignment was supposed to be done by, say, the 10th of a month, I started my grading windows from 10th to 17th. So I gave them a week of grading window. What that meant was if they wanted feedback on assignment 1, they submitted before or during this window, and they'll get feedback on time. If they miss this window, they can do assignment 1 and 2 by the second grading window, and so on. So students knew that they could finish their work at any given time and they'll get feedback by a certain date, and they knew already what that date would be. Obviously, a lot of times when I get busier or when I won't be able to meet that date, I'll update them that this is going to shift a little bit. But we were in communication, because this is an act of humanization, not just for the students, but for myself as well. As Fede points out, you need to first end with oppressor and oppressed, because I am the oppressor in this context with my students. So I have to also humanize the oppressor and the oppressed. So I started to go with this idea of grading windows instead, and just let go of all deadlines. So now I have students who are working early in the semester, working late in the semester, working consistently throughout, in peaks and chunks, and whatever works for them gives them a lot of flexibility to play around. Second was this emphasis on ungrading. And I'm using this term because it is becoming a little bit popular. I wasn't framing it as ungrading before. What I was just doing is clearly mentioning that I do not care about the grades. But I know, especially with my teacher candidates, that they expect to receive grades because they have to show it to get jobs, right? Show it to graduate. So they need to do that. So what I needed to do then was to make sure that I decenter grading and put the focus on learning and actually engaging with the content, and making this idea of getting a good grade an inevitable outcome of the learning process. What that means is that I shifted our focus on the feedback itself. So what I do is when students would say, for example, submit a reflection assignment, there would be a small rubric to go with that would just give them check boxes, right? That did you did you deliver properly? Did you make citations properly? Did you address the key readings that we were supposed to connect with? Did you connect with something else? And blah, blah, blah. All those rubric items, if they meet those criteria, they know that they're going to get the maximum amount of points for the assignment if they just do those checklists. But that's not what the assignment is really about. It's about that feedback and the back and forth that we do from there. So this focus on feedback allowed me and my students to have a conversation based on the reflection. We did not set any specific timelines or turnaround time windows for revisions. I just went from student to student that, okay, here's what I'm thinking. What are your ideas on it? And they'll reply me back and they'll revise it if they wanted to. If they didn't, if they were happy with it, we would just talk about it and we'll come to agreements. And that's how we moved forward. It was very subjective, it varied from student to student, but it did not make it risky for them in terms of grading because they had put in some value on it, and I didn't want to shake that belief too soon and too much. Next thing that I did was, and this is really hard for me because I love to be in face-to-face settings. I love to be talking with my students and working with them and constructing these ideas with them. And for me to be actually able to provide um, um, for me to be able to provide any, sorry, I was looking at the chat. For me to be able to provide them this, any sense of freedom and flexibility in asynchronous settings, I had to allow myself to step back and let the design on these online spaces take the charge itself. So what I did was I used Canvas, which again monitors your data, and I told my students how they're doing that, all of that. But I used Canvas to design these modules that they could just go through at their own pace, finish a module, finish the work, and then move on to the next one, or go in a non-linear direction, just use at their own pace. All the content that I wanted to deliver, I created that beforehand through videos, I created my own web pages within Canvas, and I just laid out an experience for them and let them run loose. Instead of the synchronous lectures, I just had fixed office hour times where students would show up just to work or just to talk with me, introduce, or even just to vent out with what was going on with them. And then move on and try and wrap up now. Collaboration and group discussions were an important part of this because I was worried that we'd be losing a lot of interpersonal and social experience. So most of the work that they were doing would also be made into groups. So as they were moving at their own paces, they collaborated with other people and figured out how they would want to proceed and how they would want to divide responsibilities and so on. And they gave them a little bit of dynamic freedom there as well. In the assignments that they submit, I make sure that it's not just a 3-page paper. I also allow them video reflections, allow them to create actually short films, create posters, but not stuff just for the sake of creativity, but things and artifacts that they would actually end up making in their professional settings. If they're teachers, if they're counselors, if they're marriage counselors, whoever they are, they would have this power to create and control content in multimodal ways. Also emphasizing on this idea of slowing down and nurturing things instead of trying to complete a lot of different things in a given period of time. I would like to summarize this, and we'll jump into discussions because I'm taking a lot of time here. By this quote, Yuval Noah Harari, who came out with an article on the COVID crisis, and he says, decisions that in normal times could have taken years of deliberation are passed in a matter of hours. Immature and even dangerous technologies are pressed into service because the risks of doing nothing are apparently bigger. Entire countries serve as guinea pigs in large-scale social experiments. What happens when everybody works from home and everybody communicates only at a distance? What happens when entire schools and universities go online? In normal times, governments, businesses, education boards would never agree to conduct such experiments. But that's the thing, these are not normal times, and the companies and the governments are taking advantage of that to some degrees. So I leave you with these questions. So how do we counter these colonial and neoliberal influences? And something to reflect on. What are we trying to be inclusive of, really? When we say inclusive pedagogy, when we say inclusion, what are we trying to include? Are we trying to include just bodies and names, or are we trying to include knowledges and knowledge systems and ways of being and ways of doing? what counts as knowledge? Whose knowledge is considered to be of value? And if we think of all of that, then what is the purpose of educational spaces, really? So to me, humanizing pedagogy, and that's my last slide, is about just this, is about being inclusive of different ways of being, different ways of existence, different ways of knowledge systems, different ways of knowing, and different ways of how we enact on these. These three are intertwined. There is no hierarchy, there is no directionality. You exist because you know that you do. To be is to do is to be, to know is to do. However you want to arrange it, it all makes sense. And if we do that, that's the best way, I think, or pretty good way for that matter, to be truly inclusive of our diversities. Thank you. Let's stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehta. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. There is a question in the chat, and then I also received another question. Let me just pose the question that came to me directly. How does COVID-19 responses to learning and teaching affect the humanizing pedagogy? You are muted, Dr. Mehta. I need to unmute you. There we go.
Right. Thank you. Could you repeat the question again? Did you say COVID-19?
Yeah. How does the question states, how does COVID-19 responses to learning and teaching affect humanizing pedagogy?
So I think it depends on what types of responses are we talking about here. So because we are all in fully online spaces now, or most of us are, if not all of us, in these fully online spaces, a lot of choice that we have on what tools we want to use, or whether we want to be in an internet-based space or not, that we don't have that choice anymore, right? We have to be in this space. So the challenge then becomes, I think, is to how do we humanize within that space? And some of the examples that I shared were mindful of that restriction, that I am still within that narrative, still within that framing of these tools and technologies that are decided by the institutions. Some of the policies of standardizations and accreditation that I have to meet because the institution expects that. And same goes with COVID-19 responses, that some of the expectations were top down. So how I like to think about this is I still have to implement humanizing pedagogies. Mm-hmm. And for me, there is some room of freedom to resist and counter within these spaces. And the biggest thing to do is to be aware of the situation that we are in. So teaching the crisis itself, that this is what is going on. It's not just me being crazy about it. This is what's happening. Here's evidence for that. This is the time that we live in. And if we acknowledge that, then we can move forward to, okay, how do we then really implement these humanizing practices?
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the chat. How would the lack of deadlines for activities and focus on individual students work out in a group of more than 300 students?
That's an excellent question, right? So I think about that all the time because some of our colleagues who teach huge class sizes, 300 students, 500 students, there's a lot of concern that if people want to implement these ideas, right? Implement more creative practices in, but then how do we manage that? How do we make sure that all students are actually being engaged in it? And what people have done to some extent successfully, I think of my colleagues at Michigan State University, what they have done is divided 300 students into all of them into small groups and made all work group work. Rather than imposing a sense of accountability, working with students through assignment work itself to establish their norms, and not impose additional norms onto them. So how would they want to proceed with their work? Who would want to take the lead? How would they want to divide responsibilities? Decide that beforehand, early in the semester, to set up the expectations, to come to an agreed upon a set of understandings that this is how each group is going to proceed with their work. What How online technologies help us do that is organize such chaos, right, through these learning management softwares, that we know that, okay, I just have to click through all these groups as an instructor and I know who's working on what and who's where at a given point. I don't have to keep track of that, right? So technologies are helping us in some ways. What's happening is the intention of the design behind that. That's what we're worried about. It's not the tool and the affordance is a constraint. We can use them to our advantage still. Um, if you have TAs, that's great. If you don't, then learning management software becomes a resource for all of us to kind of help navigate that. Would it be easy? I don't think so. It would take a lot of iterations and experiments with these huge spaces. And my suggestion from my own experience would be to go with small changes that mean something significant philosophically, that are an act of resistance to these against these practices, but small changes, one change at a time. Again, we need to slow down and nurture what we are doing instead of trying to be most effective and best practices in our context, right? So again, in summary, just keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat as well. In my experience, the strategy of combating the co-option of humanizing pedagogies enacted by universities, the inherent contradiction given that our universities are increasingly corporatized and based on neoliberal rationality, needs to be part of the discussion. The very notion of humanizing pedagogy has been individualized, restricted, warped, in Wendy Brown's words, cedes justice issues to throughput rates, etc., and part of the managerial institutional pushback is centered on this contradiction. And then a comment in question, this approach clearly works more successfully with more mature students. Any experience with first year students?
Right. So those are both excellent questions. I'll answer Nadima's question first. That's what I really truly enjoy in this work is the inherent contradictions that you're talking about. And if you remember, I started the slide with a term in parentheses, post-humanizing, for this reason, because not only we anthropomorphize our experiences, we also tend to individualize. And um, some, especially people like Edward Said, writing about Orientalism, have made cases for like how these neoliberal systems or Western systems tend to keep focusing back on individualization, even if especially when pedagogies like humanizing pedagogies fall into neoliberal systems, they tend to keep going back to individualization, right? So again, that I would say is a neoliberal influence on humanizing pedagogy itself that needs to be pushed back on. So, and that is not an individual task again. That is something that we should be doing collectively, figuring out best way forward. Um, but I mean, we can keep talking about this, but I would like to know more from what other people are saying. And to answer Rene's question, I have experimented this with freshmen, year students at Michigan State. Um, it worked even better with them. What I had to do different though was I was very honest and transparent with them. I just said that this is what bothers me about the educational system, and that is what I'm trying to do. Are they on board with me or not? It took a little bit of time for a few students because they were coming from schools and moving into universities, and they had a certain expectation of universities. Um, Biggest challenge was keeping them on task, but that also made me challenge my own beliefs of why do they have to be on task at the same time. Each student is working at their own pace, at their own level of understanding, at their own level of interest in content. I am the one who's imposing what's important, what's not important onto them, right? So what's important is that we stay in dialogue. Um, the only times that I think I did not do it effectively when I wasn't communicating with them enough, right? So what my time goes most into, especially in these online settings, is monitoring. That's the irony of this, that I do still monitor my students, their data, the very data that the big tech companies are using and collab and gathering and storing. I use this very same data to make sure that they are doing okay, right? So it's difficult, and what works in my context may not work in your context. But that's the idea, that we need to make sure that we design it carefully with our set of students in mind, and work with them, set standards with them. Whatever standards you want to set it with them for your class that works for you. Set expectations for assignments, set expectations for work with them. Let your students write those expectations down. Once you have those rubrics, those narratives, whatever you want to create, if you create it with your students, they have a sense of belonging with the material that you're creating, with the artifacts that you're creating together. And you get a little bit of, again, to use a business term, you get a little bit of buy-in from the students, right? So that you can still work within the neoliberal framework to conduct humanizing pedagogies, I feel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehta. To the participants, our time is up. Dr. Mehta, our time is up for this webinar. Thank you so much to everyone for attending and for the comments and questions. And of course, our honorable guest, Dr. Mehta from the United States. Thank you so much for joining our webinar series. And I will be posting Dr. Mehta's blog on the website shortly. Colleagues and participants, thank you so much for joining us. This is the final webinar for 2020. We are taking a break. We're going to have hopefully a relaxing period during December. And then the Humanizing Pedagogy webinars will resume from mid-Jan. So please watch the website. We have a wonderful lineup of additional great speakers that will be joining us next year again. This is the last time that I will be addressing you for the year, so please have a wonderful festive season. Please be safe wherever you are in the world, and we hopefully touch base and meet again next year in the continuation of the webinar series. Thank you so much, Dr. Mehta, and thank you to the participants, and do take care. Goodbye, everyone.